Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Chapter 1. Thomas Blood teaches us that you can get away with anything if you do it with enough confidence. Imagine the amount of money it would take to remake the British crown jewels from scratch. All the diamonds, emeralds, sapphires and rubies, all the gold, silver and platinum, and all the gem cutting, silversmithing, embossing and engraving it takes to put them all together. Now, imagine shelling out all that money to have an entire set made new, and then having someone steal your jewels and squish them to bits. And now, imagine that person being so cool and likeable and funny that instead of, stringing him up by the ghoulies outside the city gates and driving screws under his fingernails, you tell him, run along, you little scamp, don't do it again. That's what happens when King Charles II, reigned 1660 to 1685, has his jewels stolen by the notorious Thomas Blood. The crown jewels of the United Kingdom aren't just pieces of jewellery that the monarch happens to own. We're not talking here about the tiaras or necklaces or brooches that you might wear to a party. These are particular ceremonial pieces that get used in coronations. These great events involve presenting the new king or queen with all the jewels that have different symbolic meanings. Golden spurs for chivalry, a diamond-topped sceptre for justice, and bracelets for wisdom. The monarch touches these items or holds them or puts them on as part of the ritual. Finally, an orb is placed in one hand, a sceptre in the other, and the crown is placed on the head. If you've never seen these artefacts up close, you might not have clocked how utterly dripping with gems they are. They are not meant to be minimalist. Imagine a normal crown and then put a frankly silly number of stones on it. So, the natural question is, how much are the crown jewels worth? If you wanted to, you could probably look up what the value of gold is at the moment and calculate how much you'd get if you melted down all the crowns. You could add up the carats of all the diamonds and rubies and sapphires, and you could come up with a figure that way. But there is no accounting for the fact that they have been worn by British monarchs for centuries. There is nothing like them in the world. They are not insured. They are priceless. In the 1660s, Charles II is lucky to have any crown jewels at all. When he's young, his father, Charles I, goes to war against his own parliament and loses. Parliament imprisons him, finds him guilty of treason, and cuts off his head. Young Charles flees to the continent for the next 10 years, and Britain is kingless. Instead, the country is governed by Parliament, and in particular the head of their army, Oliver Cromwell, who takes the title of Lord Protector. The new rulers absolutely don't want any king coming back, so to make extra sure he can't, Parliament takes the crown jewels and melts them down. All the gems are prized off their settings, all the gold is made into coins. To this day, there are only 4 pieces in the crown jewels that managed to survive the purge: 3 swords and a golden spoon. But young Charles does come back. After Cromwell dies in 1658, he arrives in London to take the throne as King Charles II, and Britain has remained a monarchy ever since. Yet things aren't all smooth sailing for him. As well as rooting out his old enemies who beheaded his father, he needs to find the cash to make an entire set of crown jewels from scratch. In the end, he scrapes together over £12,000, enough to get him 3 brand new warships, to make 11 new pieces, including 2 crowns, an orb and a sceptre, and even a fancy gold walking stick. He is crowned in Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that pulls out all the stops, and then he puts the crown jewels in his formidable fortress, the Tower of London. However, even top-notch security in the 1670s isn't quite what it is today. There are no CCTV cameras or laser tripwires yet. Instead, the jewels are kept in a poky little tower on the corner of the castle in a locked cupboard behind a wooden grate. The tower is a big visitor attraction, so they employ a keeper to look after the crown jewels, an elderly gentleman named Talbot Edwards, who lives on site with his wife, daughter and daughter-in-law, with his son Wythe serving as a soldier on the continent. Slip Talbot Edwards a few coins, and he'll take you into the room and show you the jewels behind the grate. Slip him a couple more and he might even let you try them on. Imagine what good Instagram fodder that'd be these days. But in 1671, security is lax enough that the crown jewels are ripe for the plucking by the notorious rogue Thomas Blood, 1618 to 1680. Thomas is born in Ireland. We don't know much about his parents or his early life, but his family are relatively well off. In 1640, they're given land in Dunboyne, County Meath. If Thomas keeps his head down and plays his cards right, he could have a comfortable life as a member of the petty gentry. But the safety of being a small landowner doesn't last. Partway through Charles I's war against Parliament, 1642 to 1651, Thomas leaves the king's forces and switches sides, joining up with Oliver Cromwell. And so, when Charles II takes the throne back, the new king is none too happy with this turncoat. Thomas is stripped of his land and swears vengeance. He tries to kidnap Charles's representative in Ireland, the Duke of Ormond, several times, nearly lynching him on Piccadilly of all places, before the Duke manages to escape. You'd think, after a botched job like that, Thomas would lie low for a while, or perhaps flee the country. But being in trouble only makes him bolder. His next plan is to steal the crown jewels right out of His Majesty's fortress at the Tower of London. Early in the spring of 1671, he arrives at the Tower in disguise as the humble Dr. Ayliffe, a sweet-mannered clergyman, with an actress called Jenny Blaine pretending to be his wife. Talbot Edwards shows the good parson and his wife the crown jewels, but during the visit, Mrs. Ayliffe takes ill and has to be rushed to the Edwards flat for a reviving sip of brandy and a nice lie down. The care that the Edwardses take over her gives the Ayliffes a great excuse to come back later, once she's recovered, to thank them for their kindness. And it's then that Thomas gets chatting with Talbot Edwards himself. Thomas must be a brilliant conversationalist, because in less than a month the pair have become such good friends that they even hatch a plan to marry the Edwards' daughter to Dr. Ayliffe's wealthy nephew, a totally made-up person. On the 9th of May, Dr. Ayliffe returns to the Tower, this time with a 4-man backup. 3 guys to go into the Tower, and another waiting outside with the getaway horses. Dr. Ayliffe apologises profusely. His wife isn't here yet, but while we wait for her, how about you show my friends here the crown jewels? Talbot Edwards is only too happy to oblige his new friend. Once they're in the jewel house, the men throw a cloak over Talbot Edwards' head and tie him up. Even though they tell him that they'll kill him, he tries his best to yell and raise the alarm. They club him over the head 9 or 10 times, stab him in the gut, and leave him for dead. Then they grab the jewels. But there's a problem, which you might have guessed already. A crown does not fit into your pocket. So they have to smash it flat. Thomas takes out a wooden mallet and hammers the top of the crown, gemstones popping out and spilling over the floor. The gang then stuff the loot under their cloaks and into sacks, and head out, clinking with gold, trying to look nonchalant. Once they've left, Talbot Edwards raises his head. He's alive! Holding his side, he manages to yell once more. This time, his daughter Elizabeth, the one who was going to be married off, hears him, rushes in, and finds her father covered in blood. Thinking quickly, she raises the alarm. The thieves are not away yet. Thomas still has to pass through 2 checkpoints to get out of the tower, the Bloody Tower Gate and the Water Gate. But something you realise, reading through the history of the tower, is that any castle is only as strong as your guards are loyal. Once Thomas fires his pistol, the guards at both these gates decide that they are absolutely not paid enough to deal with this, and the gang pass through pretty much unimpeded. They make a dash for St. Catherine Dock to the east of the tower, where their horses are waiting. As they head toward the dock, they pull another utterly audacious manoeuvre, pretending that they are the ones giving chase. They start yelling, "Stop the rogues!" and so people let them pass. But still, before they get to the horses, one of the soldiers from the tower manages to catch up with Thomas, and the gang are apprehended. With Thomas and his accomplices safely behind bars, the residents of the tower start to slowly gather up the gemstones that tumbled from the crown. A barber's apprentice hands in a diamond, and a sweeping woman turns over a great pearl. Thomas is thrown in a cell to await interrogation by the lieutenant of the tower, and what will happen to him next is pretty clear: a traitor's execution. In the 17th century, high treason incurred the worst kind of execution the English legal system had to offer. First, you'd be taken to your execution site, tied to a hurdle behind a horse. Then you'd be stood up on a cart and a noose tightened around your neck before the cart was pulled away, leaving you to twist desperately in mid-air. They'd cut you down just before you asphyxiated. Next, they'd cut off your genitals, tear your stomach open, and take your insides out. Now, you might think that would kill you, but executioners who knew what they were doing could occasionally make sure you were alive just long enough to watch your insides being burned in a fire. When Major General Harrison was hanged, drawn and quartered at Charing Cross just 11 years before Thomas's stunt, he somehow managed to punch the executioner mid-disembowelment. After being gutted, you'd get beheaded, probably not going to punch anyone after that, and your decapitated body would be cut into 4 pieces. The head would be put on a spike at London Bridge, and your body parts sent to places around the country where you had friends, to warn them not to mess with the king again. This was called being hanged, drawn and quartered, and such was the fate of hundreds of men in England for centuries. But our Thomas has one final masterstroke to play. Under arrest, Thomas insists he will not speak to anyone except the king. Magistrates, guards, and the lieutenant of the tower all try to get him to talk, but to no avail. In the end, they tell King Charles II that Thomas wants to see him. Charles thinks this is hilarious, and just 3 days after being thrown in prison, Thomas is conveyed across London to the King's Palace at Whitehall. There, Charles asks him if he's the guy who tried to kidnap the Duke of Ormond, and Thomas is like, "Oh yeah, that was me. He deserved it." And then he starts confessing to stuff that Charles doesn't even ask him about. Also, one time you were swimming in the Thames at Battersea and I was going to shoot you from the riverbank, but you were so kingly and sublime that I changed my mind. He says he was overcome with an awe of majesty. Flattery will get you everywhere. And then Thomas gets really brazen. He tells Charles, "Look, there are loads of people who would totally try to avenge me if I get executed. You want all of them to come after you? It's your funeral." Then he suggests that if the king lets him go, the royal mercy will oblige the hearts of many who would perform eminent services for the crown. Here it is then. Spare me, and I'll spy for you among people who would otherwise be plotting against you. Charles asks him outright, "What if I should give you your life?" And Thomas replies, "I would endeavour to deserve it." This is the exact opposite of what you'd normally think might work. You'd expect some sort of grovelling apology and the names of any other co-conspirators, but Thomas gives neither. The courtier Thomas Henshaw reports that Thomas answered so frankly and undauntedly that everyone stood amazed. Finally, Thomas is sent back to the Tower, while Charles decides what to do with him. Why did Thomas do it? Surely if he was in need of money, there were easier and less risky ways of getting it. How could you ever sell the British crown jewels? Was he part of a massive conspiracy that was eventually planning to assassinate Charles and take the throne, and having the crown jewels ready to go would bulk up the legitimacy of the usurper? There is a single strand of evidence to support this. Around the same time, someone breaks into the Lord Chancellor's house and steals almost nothing, leaving behind his expensive clothes and jewels and taking only one thing, the Great Seal of England, which is needed to approve government documents. If you're going to say you're the real king, then this would be a powerful bit of supporting evidence. This sounds like a terrible plan, though. If the jewels get stolen in a big flashy heist, and then 6 months later the king ends up dead and a new guy turns up wearing the jewels, everyone's just going to say, oh, you're the guys that stole them then. So, was it some other kind of conspiracy? Maybe Charles was in on it from the beginning as part of a ploy to sell off the jewels and make some sorely needed cash? Maybe Thomas was working undercover for the king to test the effectiveness of the tower's defences? They're both cool ideas and would make great thriller movies, but there's no evidence to support either of them. Even people at the time can't figure it out. General Edmund Ludlow writes that he can't think what advantage there would have been to the public cause should they have succeeded in their enterprise. We don't know what drove Thomas to commit his wild and foolhardy heist. What we do know is what the king decides to do about it, and it's somehow even more shocking. Thomas gets a full pardon with a condition that he apologise to the Duke of Ormond. Thomas is like, I'll let him kick me in the arse if it'll get me out of prison, and writes the most cowering, grovelling, desperately apologetic letter you've ever read, calling himself an unworthy monster and his actions a most heinous crime. The Duke accepts his apology. He can hardly not if the king's going to forgive him for stealing his crown. On the 14th of July, 1671, Thomas becomes a free man again, pardoned not just for the jewel heist, but for every crime he's ever committed up to that point. Not only that, but he's given a pension of £500 per year and gets his land in Ireland back. Why would the king do such a thing? Does Thomas have some dirt on him? Was the king in on it to begin with? Both are exciting theories, but neither has ever been proven. Instead, Thomas has something else he can offer Charles in exchange for his life. You see, war with the Netherlands is on the horizon, and it's going to sorely test the loyalty of Thomas's friends, many of whom are deeply committed nonconformists, Protestants who belong to sects other than the Church of England, such as Baptists and Presbyterians. At the moment, these people don't have many rights to worship as they please in England, so they stand to gain if the Netherlands wins the war. Thomas could be a really good spy on these people, telling them how great the king is and keeping tabs on anyone who gets too treasonous. One of Charles's ministers later says that Thomas's help as an informer is worth 10 times the crown. Within a few weeks, Thomas is strutting around the King's Palace at Whitehall with a new suit and wig, being invited to dinner at the homes of noblemen, and even buying himself a fancy new house near Westminster Abbey. Poor old Talbot Edwards, the man tasked to keep the crown jewels safe, is nowhere near as lucky. Charles writes a royal warrant granting him £200 for his efforts, but he never actually gets it, and has to struggle to raise the money for his medical treatment himself. Thomas, though, goes on to have a grand old life, hobnobbing with the Archbishop of Canterbury and mooching around the King's Palace. When he's arrested for debt, he's bailed out by a mysterious benefactor, and when he finally dies of illness in 1680, he's so notorious for scheming and treachery that people think he's faked it to get out of paying his debts. People swear they've seen him walking around Westminster bold as you please. So 6 days after he's buried, an inquest digs up his grave to check he's really down there. Horrifyingly, they find the corpse so bloated from the August heat that even his friends can't identify him, and they have to rebury him without a verdict. Maybe Thomas really does cheat both death and his creditors. Thomas Blood committed one of the most audacious, outlandish crimes in British history, and he didn't even have a good explanation as to why. To this day, the question of exactly what he was thinking remains a mystery, one where there aren't even enough tidbits of documentary evidence for historians to have a proper argument about. Even more mysterious is the question of why Charles decided to give him a pardon, when it seems like Thomas didn't have any leverage at all. Maybe Charles really did just think Thomas was funny. One thing seems to come clearly out of Thomas's story, and it's that you can get away with anything if you do it with enough confidence. That is chapter 1 of Mavericks, Life Stories and Lessons of History's Most Extraordinary Misfits, which is out now in hardback, ebook, and audiobook formats from all your favourite booksellers. I really hope you enjoy it, and I will see you next time.